All right, cool. So we are now live, Steve. So look alive. Hey.
Oh, I'm still reading. You can't stop me from reading.
Oh, that was a good joke. You didn't appreciate that joke of it's a near death experience. Look alive. Anyway, so
Oh, got
welcome
it.
to
Okay. Sherry
welcome
says
every.
you have to put the crumbs close together for me, particularly with jokes. Go for it.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to our episode where we talk. This is a special movie review episode. As you guys know, After Death, the movie has just come out a few weeks back. I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. With maybe it's more than that by now, but it came out. Angel Studios produced it. For those who don't know, it's a movie about near death experiences. And I have to say, the production quality of the film was really well done. I think anyone who would go see it would find it entertaining for different reasons, whether you like the personal testimony or maybe you're more interested in the evidence. I think it was just an overall well produced film. But today we're going to be talking about it from our perspectives. We're going to look at it from all the different angles we possibly can. Spoiler alert, we are probably going to reveal a lot of the plot. But nonetheless, I think that's what most of you are here for. So we're going to get into it today and get Steve's opinion. And we both saw it with our wives, and it was fun to get their opinions. And so I'll share some of that. But that's what we're going to be talking about today. So welcome to the episode. If you guys have questions or if you want to engage with us, always feel free to comment in the comment section below. For those who are new here, we talk near-death experiences and deathbed experiences and their relevance in helping us determine which worldview is the correct worldview or the accurate or true worldview. That's what we mean by the right worldview. So, without further ado, Steve, let's get your general thoughts, and then we can kind of jump off from there in terms of what we're going to talk about.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed the movie. I think it's just wonderful that something that's been researched so well over, wow, almost 50 years now, that it gets play in a movie theater. I mean, I just think that's wonderful that so many could be exposed to this research. They interviewed some of the main researchers, which was wonderful. Dr. Sabone, particularly, I believe he was listed number two when he told about the actors or people interviewed.
Mm,
I have a huge respect for him because I think he was the first person to really put the study of near death experiences on a scientific basis. I mean, Moody interviewed a bunch of people, talked about the interviews. Sabum said, okay, let's compare what they're saying with the hospital records and let's actually, dig deeper into it and see if these people are actually seeing something outside of their bodies. I think he established that to great effect. It's been replicated over time. But to have I mean, some of us are getting older, and people like Dr. Sabom, Dr. Bruce Grayson, and others have studied these, Dr.
mm,
Long, their entire lives,
mm,
and now we get to hear the result of a lifetime of research on these. And
mm,
wasn't technical going into all the research, but you at least got an overview of the research that had been done, mixed with the testimonies of people who have been through it. So it was a good mix of both to keep you entertained as well as informed and to whet your appetite for learning more about these significant experiences.
Yeah, I think that it was cool because when Dr. Long mentions this in the film, I think it was kind of a bypassing moment, but it really stuck out to me because I was wondering, I think people in their minds have the question of why now, relative, because the study of near death experiences is relatively new in the long history. So it's like really you have George Ritchie's testimony, and that kind of spurs on life after life, and so from there you kind of see life after life become the catalyst that launches all these other researchers who kind of so on and so forth, and they detail this in the film, and it's just like a quick moment where Dr. Long mentions, or it's not even Dr. Long, I think it's Dr. Moody mentions the cardiopulmonary resuscitation efforts have substantially improved due to medical advances in relatively last 50 to 100 years, and therefore that's why we're seeing so much more resuscitations, and therefore the documentation and the near death experience seems to happen more frequently than it traditionally did. I mean, there's definitely a lot of work to support that near death experiences have been around as long as written history has been. I mean, they note Plato's Republic and his supposedly documented near death experiences in that work. So I just thought it was really cool that they did mention that, because I think that's always been a question in my mind: is why don't we see more documentation before the 1970s? And that's really what it is, right? Is it's medical advancements that have really allowed the research to take off. And everybody who was interviewed for data in the movie, ironically, in the evidence, I guess it's not ironically, is medical doctors, right? It's unironic, but it's all MDs that are the ones that are providing the scientific analysis. Steve, I wanted to ask you, scientific analysis and science and the science, those words get used and thrown around a lot. So I'd like for us to kind of define, what do we mean by scientific proof for near-death experiences, or evidence rather, for near-death experiences? Let's just define that so people know kind of like what we mean by that when we say that.
This is one of the key issues that I see hardly anyone dealing with. And I think what happens is, as we go through school, we hear a definition of science, or we're in a specific field of science, and then we define science as it's done in that field, and we assume that all science is that way. So, the need for this, like I had one student, I was reading her paper this morning. She had
Mm,
read a book on near death experiences, and she said, well, that's good stuff, but of course, it's not really science, because in science you have to be able to replicate what you found,
yeah,
and you have, and she gave a couple of things, and I just replied to her and said, well, okay, so is astrophysics not science because they talk about a big bang which you can't replicate? Well, no. Is is other science, like legal science, is that not really science, that you're talking about things that happen in the past that you
yeah,
can't
forensics.
replicate? And so I think everybody has this idea of the science that they really think is true, but if you look it up on the web and start looking at definitions, you'll find out they differ significantly, and there's no consistent view. So what do you do with that? Uh, to me, you've got to look at your definition and say, let's look at what we consider legitimate sciences, like forensics, and we see astrophysics, and all these are sciences. So if something about your definition is going to cancel some of those out as real sciences, there's something wrong with your definition. It's not broad enough.
Mm,
So, what is science? Actually, a lot of these definitions where you see the 5 steps of the scientific method, a lot of that was it was not what the originators of science came up with. But John Dewey, I think in the 1900s, was talking about how to determine if something is true or not. And he gave like 5 little steps, and some scientists said, hey, that's kind of what we do in science. And they kind of adopted these 5 steps, after the fact of establishing the sciences, and said that's science. But really, science is done differently in different divisions. I think a good definition that's broad enough to incorporate all the sciences is to say that basically science is coming up with evidence for things you believe. And that evidence can be divided into 2 broad categories: uh, data and reasoning. So scientists come up with data in order to establish whatever they're trying to establish as a truth. Like, was there a Big Bang? They look for data. Oh, well, there's this cosmic radiation that's coming from somewhere. That's evidence maybe it all originated as a Big Bang. And then you see the change in the color spectrum showing of the stars, showing that that the universe is expanding. And then there's several lines of evidence that accumulate. That's your data. And then you reason from that data saying, ooh, if these things are happening, the most consistent hypothesis that seems to encompass this is that there was actually a beginning to the universe. So, data and reasoning. So, how do people like Sabom use this data? They say, well, let's look at this experience. Let's take 2 hypotheses, the dying brain hypothesis, and let's take a supernatural hypothesis. Sabom started off as a scientist and said, I just don't believe this stuff about people having these experiences. I haven't seen them in my patients. So he took the challenge, began interviewing his patients, and after a few interviews, he came across one that had had a near death experience. So his data started suggesting, oh, well, people actually believe they've had these experiences. They have these memories from the time that they were experiencing cardiac arrests. Now, let's see what we can make of these. Are they just hallucinations? Or are they real? So he comes up with an experiment. Let's interview people who, cardiac patients who have had a near death experience and those who had cardiac arrest but did not have a near death experience. Let's do an experiment here, take our data, get new data by saying, how, which of those can actually describe accurately what happened in their cardiac arrest and in their resuscitation. The ones who claim to have had a near death experience and saw it from outside their bodies got it correct. The other ones did not. So, what's your conclusion? You've got your data. Now, your reasoning gets into that and says, okay, what's the best hypothesis to explain this new data that we have? I think there's strong evidence that these people were outside of their bodies.
Mm.
Dualism must be true. You must be able to exit your bodies. So that's what I'm talking about when I define science. You're using data and reasoning as evidence to support what you believe rather than blind faith. Does that
Yeah.
make sense to you? And does that kind of feed into the film? Because I think that's what they were doing with the film is they were saying, hey, we've been studying these things for almost 50 years from now. What is the data
Mhm.
telling us? Let's interview Dr. Long. Let's interview Dr. Sabom. Let's see where we are with the evidence and try to make sense of this fascinating experience.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that makes sense. So if I was to summarize kind of that point, it's scientific process is the process of producing reliable data, but then you have to use reasoning to develop a scientific hypothesis. Or excuse me, did I say that correctly? Scientific data, the scientific process establishes reliable data, and that's what we mean by can you reproduce it, right? Is can you reproduce the data? And then you use reasoning to kind of take away from the data to determine, okay, this is what the data is supporting. But that's where you could have one scientist come to one hypothesis and another scientist come to another. And then they're both interpreting the same data. Both are interpreting the same data coming from their scientific analysis, but then the theories and what the scientists are coming to, they use reason to do that, right? It's essentially, it's a philosophical exercise after that to determine what the data is saying.
Yes. So, I mean, you're using both. Some people will say, oh, it's just all empirical. It's just about the data. No, it's not. You're using
No,
your
no.
reasoning to determine what does this data mean and what's the best hypothesis that we have that best fits the data.
Yeah, I can think, from my time in school, one of the things that really stood out to me was, just to digress just for a quick moment to maybe help illustrate this, is the young Earth versus old Earth argument, right? And so in my
Mhm.
research, one of the discussions was kind of like looking at the Grand Canyon and saying, hey, based on what we know about water and the erosion of rocks, and we look at the Grand Canyon, you can summarize, you can assume that water flowing at the same rate that it's currently flowing at would take millions of years to cut this far into the rock, right? And that's the assumption that the pattern, i.e., the water flow, is the same throughout history. And the young Earth creationists come along and say, we agree with water erosion causing the rocks to be cut and the Grand Canyon to be formed, but we think that there was large bursts, large gushes of water, substantial increases of water flow in periods of time that resulted in the illusion that this canyon was cut over a long period of time, but really it was cut through 3 or 4 major water events. And I thought that that was super fascinating because it's like they're not disagreeing that water erodes rock and that water cut through and made the Grand Canyon. What they're disagreeing upon is how much water and how much time. And that's the part that's really challenging to kind of come to the conclusion of. So, of course, old Earth is just looking at a pattern and saying, this is the pattern. This has been the pattern for a long period of time. And this is the pattern that will sustain, versus a young Earth is saying, no, there was catastrophic events that happened which utterly transformed. We agree that water cut through. So all this to say, okay, and that's why it was a digression. All this to say that can you hear me
There's the
still?
data.
Yeah, right.
Yes, there's the data and there's the interpretation of the data. And so I think it's very significant that these people who've studied it now, the major part of their adult lives are saying, I mean, Sabom, I was just talking to him a few minutes ago, and he's like, I believe this is a spiritual experience. He just believes that all the study that we've done of naturalistic hypotheses uh, uh, are just saying that these don't work. These are not sufficient to explain the experience. We're actually coming out of our bodies. This is a spiritual experience. And then you look at uh, virtually all the researchers that I see that have really done the original research on this and continue to study it for their entire lives. And now some of them are no longer professors, they're just now retiring and they can look back on a lifetime of research. I believe all of them will agree this is some kind of a spiritual experience that can't be fully attributed to naturalism, which is a strong argument against naturalism itself. Naturalism says that everything can be explained via purely natural stuff without bringing the supernatural. These are saying there's something supernatural going on here, and we've studied it for our lifetimes, and there's plenty of data here to support that hypothesis. And I think that's what the movie's about. It doesn't bore us with the evidence; it gives it in small snippets that you really have to go into further reading to get the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
But it presents the evidence, it presents some cases, and presents some of the implications of all of this to our lives.
Yeah, I have to say that is one thing that kind of surprised me, Steve, going into the film, was how much time they allocated to actual discussions of the evidence. I thought that they laid out a very strong case, and I thought that they did an amazing job of taking the time that they had to summarize I thought you moved through a lot of the evidence very, very quickly, and you get this kind of very large body of evidence within the film in a relatively short period of time. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it served as a very good introductory film to kind of give you a base knowledge of near-death experiences and why they're such an interesting phenomenon to begin with. But like you said, you're not going to get as much of the intricate details as if you had gone to the readings, of course, right? Because they have a lot more time and space to air out those thoughts and the data points and kind of what you can conclude from them, and then just more thoughts around the whole thing. But I do agree with you about they did the best they could to kind of say, okay, here's some data, and then here's a personal testimony, and then let's kind of move back and forth, because it's always funny because the data appeals to our intellect, right? It appeals to our reasoning. It appeals to us saying, okay, this is reliable, this is interesting. But the experiences themselves, the testimony themselves, is what brings that data to life and makes it vibrant and emotional and impactful, and makes it move from your head to your heart of, wow, like imagine if I had had this experience. And I thought the film just understood that nuance extremely well. And I think that it probably came from speaking to a lot of people who've been in this industry for a while, writing books and research on it, because they've understood that, if they sit there and they just talk about the data that's in their research reports, that they start seeing people
Mhm.
nodding off in the audience and falling asleep. But when they kind of interweave this data with, and let me tell you about this experience that kind of illustrates this point, it really gets people drawn back in, because those experiences are fascinating and they are full of kind of the human soul's curiosity. It kind of satiates to some degree some of that curiosity. So I feel like that's why you could tell that they got good advisors, because good advisors told them this is how you need to produce this film in order to properly convey the reliability of these experiences, but also the fascination, and the intrigue of these experiences.
And visually, I notice on commercials and all kinds of televised things, how quickly the frames, I don't know if you call it frames or what, the camera angle all of a sudden shifts, and it's like every 15 seconds or so. I mean, on a
Mm,
commercial, it may be every 5 seconds.
right.
But they kept things moving to keep people who are used to watching films today, to keep them interested. And they took a lot of time, for example, the Pam Reynolds case, rather than just giving the evidence broadly, to center in on Pam Reynolds, they took a lot of time to interview key figures in the research on the Pam Reynolds case. And that was just such a dramatic case that Dr. Sabom had originally researched uh, vastly. And to be able to get that out there and interview people who say, yeah, I saw Pam Reynolds when she first woke up. Of course, she's the one who had to undergo a unique surgery where they drained all the blood out of her head. Her eyes were taped up. There were many, many
Yeah, yeah,
decibels
right.
going into her ears constantly to monitor her brainstem. There was no EEG, EKG stuff going on, nothing with the
Yeah, for all intents
brainstem.
and purposes, she was
And then
dead.
she was dead. And then when she comes back, the first person that talked to her was there, and he's like freaked out. It was good that this was coming out over about Halloween, right?
Hmm.
Because I mean, these people are freaked out and they're like, doctor, you've got to come talk to this patient. She shouldn't know this stuff. How does she know what went on during that surgery? Specific things people were saying, specific places. Why were they looking at her groin when this was about her head? Why were they putting, in these why were they talking about the size of her veins or whatever? Why was this? How could she have possibly known all this? She couldn't see a thing. Her eyes were taped shut. Okay.
Mm.
She couldn't hear through her ears. There was nothing going on in her brain. And I thought that this has been so well documented. It was great that before these people die, they actually got their personal testimonies on film to say what happened. I mean, that was just invaluable, even if they had only gotten her case together and Sabom's evidence um, from his research. That was just well done, and they took the time to get it right.
Yeah, well, and the focus on Pam Reynolds' case is because of how many factors are being monitored simultaneously. It's kind of like you're eliminating all the possible explanations for near-death experiences in the Pam Reynolds case because you're draining the blood and you're doing, the ticking in the ears and the eyes. You're eliminating all these potential sources of explanation, and yet this experience still happens and it still follows the unique pattern that we see within near-death experiences. I wish they'd spent maybe a little more time kind of detailing that and how that pattern is what's so important because and it was probably just a time thing really because they didn't really have the chance. They briefly touch on DMT and some of these other hallucinatory drugs that can simulate aspects of it. And that's what John Burke was saying in the film. It's like, look, it simulates aspects of it, but it doesn't simulate the entirety of the experience nor the pattern to any degree of seriousness. So I think from my perspective, that was one thing I was just trying to, like, in my mind, I had, we had spoken briefly before I went and saw the film, and you had said that one review you saw basically called it Christian propaganda. And like that has really stuck out in my mind and just played on a loop over and over and over again. Not only before I saw the film, but after I saw the film. And I'm just trying to look at it from the person's perspective who would have said that. And I have such a hard time agreeing with that position because I felt like they tried as hard as they could to represent it in a here's the data, here's the experiences as told by these people we've spoken to, make of it what you will. And I thought that they tried to include experiences that were very, let's say, high quality near death experiences, not just, oh, I had an OBE or, oh, I had this experience. I felt like they really tried to go after these ones that were very high quality, had a lot of depth to them, had a lot of study around them and story around them, and just bring to light as honest of a case as they could. I feel like they were trying to make an honest case for what happens after death. And so the idea that it would be like Christian propaganda or even necessarily slanted toward Christian ideals or the worldview, I felt like they tried hard to not necessarily make that happen. I mean, I felt you could, if you made any argument, maybe like theistic propaganda, I guess you could say it's more like that, but I don't necessarily know if it tried to resonate specifically with the Christian worldview more than any other worldview. I guess the only argument I could see being made is like you didn't include any near-death experiences where they talk about meeting gods from other religions or something like that.
Yeah, and I'd say that again, they're just sticking with the data.
Mm,
If you're talking about, okay, this person says they saw Krishna on the other side, but if Krishna is their name for the high God,
mm-hmm.
okay, well, that's not really that much difference. But you just don't find many niche NDEs that are promoting anti-Christian type doctrine. So I
Mm-hmm.
think they're just sticking with the data to not do that and to throw some of that in there to say, okay, we're going to be fair to all worldviews. You just get into a mess that's not really documented well within the research itself. They could have made it much more Christian had they wished to. They could have shared the gospel at the end, but it's not an
Mm,
evangelistic film. They're not trying to get people all whipped up and then have them make some decision for Christ. I'd call it pre-evangelistic from that standpoint. I think it's good evidence that the soul can separate from the body, that there is an afterlife, that there is a God, that they're seeing things on the other side. But it just leaves it at that, so that I think it's something that helps us in our search, particularly those who believe in a materialism that says everything that happens can be explained materially. Well, here are counter examples that have been well studied over the past 45 years. Let's look at those, throw that into the mix, and maybe you'll rethink whether there's something out after death. It did have a pastor who was involved, but he didn't come across very pastoral.
yeah.
He had done
Yeah.
his own research on near-death experiences, which had impacted him personally in a great way. He just expressed the results of that research in his life. And also the one who is the atheist professor who had went to the hospital in France,
Yeah. Howard
and
Storm.
he was Howard Storm. This was a horrible experience, and it showed what a distressing or hellish experience is like. And you say, oh, well, you're trying to scare people to Jesus. Well, actually, maybe 20% of near death experiences are hellish. I just applaud them for saying the evidence shows that a good many of these are hellish. Why not show a hellish experience? And you know what? They could have said that Howard Storm, which is true, he was an atheist, he was a professor, he was very prideful, stuck on himself. After that experience, he was totally humbled, and he talked about becoming almost an evangelist to other people, which turned a lot of people off. What they didn't say, I don't believe they mentioned this in the film, he actually went to seminary after that. His life was so transformed
Mm-hmm.
and became a pastor for the rest of his life. Now, if this were Christian propaganda, surely you would have put that in there, because that is evidence in that case that this experience led him to a Christian worldview. But they didn't put it in there. I
No.
think they were trying to be cautious not to be a Christiany evangelistic film. Let's just get people thinking about this thing that's been studied greatly.
Yeah, Stephen, and that's kind of the content of my book is this idea that the book Afterlife Apologetics. It's kind of like, I mean, I'm very explicit in the book that I think Christianity is outright far and away the best worldview to explain these experiences, hands down. But I think that like when you watch the film, it's kind of implicitly Christian. And I think it's because like you start running the worldviews in your head if people who are generally familiar with different worldviews, and they're like, well, that doesn't really sound like people are reincarnated on the other side because they're holding their identities. I mean, that kind of very quickly debunks that idea, because you get there and, deceased grandfather and grandmother and friends and so on and so forth are there waiting for you. And then the God that gets over there, it's love, it's joy, it's peace, it's all these positive attributes. It's just like you're like, man, what world view, what religion, what religious figure made that their kind of central preaching point and the
This is
emphasis of there.
obviously not an impersonal God that they're meeting on the other side. This is a God who cares intensely with how they're living their life and is showing his love to the people. That doesn't really sit well with pantheism, for example, or
Yeah,
panentheism, which has an impersonal God as the center of that worldview.
yeah, and there's a lot of other great nuances to point out there. I don't want to get too far sucked down that rabbit hole, but I think it's, my point is, I think like your subconscious betrays you in a sense that you walk away from the film going, what an utterly Christian film. But when you really look at it, you're like, well, I guess there wasn't really a whole lot of specific Christian teaching or doctrine or theology. It was just people telling the experiences that they had and kind of going from there and talking about the data. And to kind of to your point of, scaring people to Jesus or something like that, I just really quickly want to note, I don't I don't have any problems with that on a philosophical basis of, if I had a box of TNT and I said, "Hey, you light a match in there with the TNT, it's going to blow up and kill you. And let me show you some film of people who've lit TNT and look what happened to them." And you go, "Ah, you're just trying to scare me into being scared of dynamite." I feel like I would, yes, I am, because it's in your benefit that you understand that it's a scary thing and there are real devastating consequences to not understanding it. And so, in terms of, distressing experiences and scaring to people to Jesus or whatever, making people fearful, look, if hell is real, people need to know,
True,
right?
true.
And if we really want to love people, we're going to tell them, hey, just so you know, there is a terrible side to this whole afterlife thing. And there are people who end up going there, and here's some evidence of that experience. So I would just say, to me, it's like, regardless of if you believe in it or if you don't, I don't think philosophically it makes sense to ignore it, because if it's real, then it's very much important to talk about and note that, because it is a real consequence.
And it was not, because we dealt with that, because there was that element in there from Howard Storm's testimony of being, like, dragged down to hell with demons or something, not really to
Right.
hell, but it was a negative experience. That was not the feel of the whole film to me. That was, they threw that in there, which I thought was very legitimate, since 20% or so of the experiences are of that nature, or at least include some negativity in them like that. So I thought that was very appropriate following the evidence. But in general, I think you felt better about the afterlife. There's this
Hmm.
loving God over there, and wow, I ought to see, I hope it provoked seeking among people
They
to
said that.
learn
They
more
said that
about it.
phrase in the film. I
I
thought of
remember
you.
that.
I thought of you
Yeah,
when they
yeah.
said that. They're like, "I want you to be seeking and seek him out." I think it was the Asian gentleman who had said the old man had told him to cut his own throat and his stomach, and I think he mentions that he uses that phrase, and so I thought of you when I
It
heard it. I was like,
caused him to seek.
exactly,
Yeah, and
exactly, yeah.
I think that is so significant, because those who seek will find. And I think if you look at visions in the Bible, it's not like they give the whole gospel in these things. It's like they're to provoke you, to give you some direction in life. And I think that's kind of what the film did. It wasn't
Hmm.
going to fill in all the pieces for you of how to get to heaven, but it was going to provoke you to seek. And I think if you seek, you'll find. Jesus wasn't even, you'd expected Jesus a lot of times to say, when he was asked, well, what have I yet to do? And he'd say, well, go sell all you have and give to the poor. And you're like, wait a minute, where's the gospel in that? Well, I think he's hitting people where they are, provoking them to seek, and if eventually they'll seek, they'll fill in all the gaps. But he wasn't eager, and in the visions we see of the Apostle Paul and others, They didn't fill in all the pieces for you,
Yeah.
but they set you in the right direction and motivated you to seek, and I think that seeking phase is very important to God.
Well, and I
Seek
want to,
and keep on seeking, and you shall find.
yeah, Steve, what sticks out to me is, Jesus saying, "There are many who will come to me in that day, Lord, Lord, did I not cast out demons in your name? Did I not do all these great things in your name?" And Jesus will say, "Depart from me, I did not know you, you worker of iniquity." And I think what you have to understand there is a lot of people, I think, on this side of heaven get obsessed with having the intellectually correct answer. And then these near
Mm,
death experiences seem to place a massive emphasis on God is judging you by your heart. What is your heart's intent? Are you trying to seek him out? Are you trying to respond to truth and correctness and rightness when it's given to you? Are you seeking that out? Because to me, that's like, you can have Christians who understand the Christian worldview is correct, but then be bankrupt when it comes to their intentions and what they want, and really what it's all about. Of, yeah, Jesus is the way, and let me cast out demons in his name, and look at what I'm doing for Jesus,
mhm,
right? And so it's like, versus, Jesus is trying to make the emphasis of, this is about love, this is about joy, this is about the intent of your heart, and understanding these relationships are paramount. So I'm saying all this to say that I think, I constantly say this all the time, I think Christians are going to be shocked at who gets into heaven. um, and frankly, I'm all for it, because I think that by, we've talked about this a lot on this podcast, because we both see this emerge theologically from the text, but also from the evidence of these experiences, that God is very much evaluating based off of the knowledge that you have, which again, we think theologically there's a lot of support for that, and the intent of your heart. Like, are you trying to seek him out? Are you trying to respond to what you're given, the light that you're given? Are you responding to that? And then there's going to be people who have been given a lot of light, who know the gospel, who know that Christ is the truth, and given all kinds of evidence, and they maybe choose to follow it, but they choose to follow it because it's about them and what they can accomplish and how they can make the spotlight about them, of, what they're doing for Jesus. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad position. I'm just saying, I can't evaluate your heart, but God can. He can see deep down what your motivations are, deep down what you really want to accomplish. Do you really want to see people better off? Do you really want to help people? Do you really want to subdue the sinful, prideful aspects of yourself and submit to something greater than yourself? Or is it really just about you? Are you really just using this to get forward? And it can be it's frustrating for me to see some Christians just get so up in arms about Christianity, 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 when it's like, fundamentally, I don't think that they're trying to meet people where they're at, just like God tries to meet people where they're at in these experiences. And Jesus was never bashing people when he meets them. I mean, he's going to tell people when they're wrong, but I feel like he does it in a loving way of like, "Oh, no, that's just the wrong position, and here's the correct way to go with that." Now, of course, with the Pharisees, I think he understood with them, especially, he's very harsh with them. And I think it's because they're that type of, they are religiously correct, but their heart is just completely in the wrong place. And so that is upsetting to him, because he knows that they have the right information and are still choosing to not act on it.
and bringing this back to the film, Christian or non-Christian, we tend to justify the way we behave and see very clearly the fault in others. Like Jesus said, don't
Yeah.
why are you judging, the speck in your brother's eye when you have a plank in your own eye? And
Yeah.
I think that's what Howard Storm saw in his near death experience, and that's what my wife said. One of the things that hit her was just how, for Howard Storm, he could look back and was just appalled to see his decisions that
Mm,
he was making in life,
yeah.
how they hurt other people, and yet he had probably justified all that through his life, the way he was, because of the
Yeah.
way his father treated him or whatever, okay? 'Cause so he just, we all tend to justify the way we are, but I think this film makes us see, Christian or non-Christian alike, evaluate your motives, evaluate what's going on. Are you truly loving people, or is it all about you?
Right.
So there's a lot of solid outcomes from this film that I think are very, very impactful. And there's not a lot of like I don't remember if any scripture was quote. There's just not much
No.
scripture quoted. It's not a Christiany film,
Okay.
but I think it's one that'll make us think about our personal lives. What are we living for? And some of us just don't want to think about death at all. And this is an opportunity to get in there and say, hey, as Jesus said, if what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose or forfeit himself? Well, we better think about the end and what we're living for and how to live in the light of that. I think the
Mhm.
film did a great job of mentioning it. Other strengths that you saw, or did you want to talk about any weaknesses that you saw?
One thing that also comes to mind that I did want to with you about, and I wanted to get your perspective on this, was I found it really fascinating that the people that were interviewed post their experiences, you would think that life would just be hunky dory and easy, and I know the ending, and it's all great, and there's no strife, and blah blah blah, right? It's all
Mhm.
rainbows and roses, and it's awesome. And it just seemed like after their experience, it was devastation, it was depressing, it wasn't all just better. It affected them deeply, and it really gave them a sense of gravity as to what's important into life. But I think it struck me how much they just longed to be back there,
Mm.
and the life that they had here on Earth just felt foreign to them. And Howard Storm's story is especially, uh, in a sense, tragic, because he comes back and his wife leaves him, and she poisons the kids against him, and he's trying to repair all these relationships. And I can only imagine in him the confusion and the sense of, God, why is this happening? I have associated my life with the principles you've told me. I'm loving. I'm trying to care for people. I'm trying to get into this connection and heal past wounds and see love as paramount in these relationships and just really restore myself. And yet I am alone in my deepest and most important relationships with my wife and my children, and they don't want to have anything to do with me because of this experience you gave me. And it really makes me, personally, going into the film, there's a part of me that's like, I wish I could have one, right? If I'm going to
Mm.
be completely honest with you, I would say, oh yeah, I would love to have a near death experience. But after watching the film, it really challenged me personally on that position, because it's like, would I want, it's kind of like eating your dessert before your meal. It's like it kind of sours your appetite in a sense of like, you would just want the glory and the joy of heaven. And, like, you wouldn't see the beauty of the intricate relationships you have now. And it almost makes me think that maybe the grandiose and the beauty of having these near death experiences is a burden. It's a cross to bear when you come back, because now you have to live the rest of your life with firsthand knowledge of what you're missing out on. And oh my goodness, imagine the depth and the sinfulness and the depravity of this world, but seeing it from such the perspective of having a heavenly near death experience. Wouldn't that just, it's like you long for this. And Allie's just like, you come away from the film with the question of like, why doesn't God just give everybody one of these and just be done with it, right? And then it's like, hey, you have firsthand evidence of God in heaven, and now you can make the decisions of what you will, and everybody's on the same page. And it's like, yeah, I've had a near death experience. Haven't you had one? Yeah, I saw heaven. I don't believe in Jesus. And it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess there's nothing to be said there. So anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. I'm sorry, but I'm trying to give some context to just kind of like the wrestling I'm doing with that question, and that
Mhm.
takeaway I had from the film of just, it doesn't seem, I don't want to call near death experiences almost like a curse, but it seems like a burden to have one and then come back and have to deal with the changes in life and the struggle of having such a deep and real connection, imagining the God of the universe and loving you like you're the only thing he ever created. I can only imagine how kind of disappointing relationships in life would be, because you would never get back to that level. And so, that was just a big takeaway for me, Steve, that
Yeah, yeah, I think I have students who'll say, "Well, that's unfair. Why do they get to have this
Right,
experience and I
exactly.
don't?"
Exactly.
Now, the
Yeah.
more I've read about it, the more I thought, number one, these people were in like Howard Storm. I don't know how long it took him to recover
Hmm.
from that illness. Look at some of the others with the one with the kayaking accident.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that took a long time to recover for, and she's probably never
No.
completely physically
Yeah.
whole after all that. The plane crash, oh my
Mhm.
goodness, how long would it take to recover from that? And so you've got a horrible recovery from these things. You wouldn't want to take the accident with it. You just
Mhm.
want the experience, but
Right.
no after effects. But then, when I watch a movie, I don't really like to watch a movie by myself. I like to watch it with Sherry or somebody that it can experience it with me. And I think a huge part of the problem is you've had this realer than real
Oh, that's
experience
a
of
great
the
point
other side, and nobody really else in
to
your life
share it
that's
with.
already close to you wants to talk about it.
Mm.
So you can imagine coming to them and telling, "Oh, I had this wild experience," and after 5 minutes of talking, they change the subject because it's just kind of, weird and embarrassing,
Yeah.
and then they don't wanna really hear about it anymore.
Mhm.
And so you've had this incredible experience that hardly anybody else could seem to relate to
Yeah.
if you don't know someone else who's had the experience. That's gotta be a lonely thing.
Mm.
And 2, your values, the person that Howard Storm married
Right.
probably liked him the way he
He
was. That's the
was. Yeah.
reason she married him.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know what happened, they didn't tell later. I hope they got together later in their experience or whatever in life. But yes, and Jesus himself had that kind of uncomfortable conversation where he talked about that I'm here to separate
Yeah.
people who even within families, there's gonna be separation and
Yeah.
animosity between one another.
Right.
Now, for me, it's certainly enhanced my relationships being a Christian, but if you were headed one direction, all of a sudden you make an about face and your family's not ready to make that decision and your best friends are not ready to make that decision, all of a sudden it can be a very lonely experience.
Well, it enhanced your
And I think that's
relationships.
one reason we need to be able to minister to people who've had these experiences. And as a church, we continue to ignore these experiences, these people need someone to minister to them because they have a lot they need to talk about. And the Bible says we're supposed to be quick to listen, quick
Mhm.
to hear, right? We need to listen to these people authentically because lots of people that are important in their lives are not listening to them and they need help working their way through this experience.
But I was gonna say, Steve, is that the values you have are why it enhanced your relationship because you were able to find in Howard Storm's situation, it's probably the values he had changed dramatically right after his
Yes,
experience, and
yes, yes.
that's why he grew apart from his wife because she probably wanted to place high value on things that he moved away from, right? Like maybe the achievements and the materialistic,
Perhaps.
right? And
Sure.
so that's maybe where where the gap grows from. Whereas, Christians are growing together and creating essentially families together because now you're in a community that identifies with the values you have, such as the importance of relationships, the importance of your loving people, enjoying people, and the ripple effects of the words you say and the interactions you have is very important. A hope for me is that this film was cathartic, deeply cathartic for people who have had NDEs
Hmm.
and haven't been able to talk about it with other people because I can only imagine the weight of that. I think it's imagine the most impactful moment in your entire life and you can't talk about it with really anyone. I can only imagine the frustration and the anger and the outright loneliness that would result from that. So again, I hope this film is out there right now kind of building bridges like you said. I know our hardest for that is helping us build a bridge between the church community and people who've had these experiences and kind of help them understand how to navigate through it and be understanding and also able to discern what should be accepted from the experience, and then what should maybe be challenged or questioned, but done so with a compassionate ear, and a willingness to listen. Again, because if you're experiencing it, people who are having experiences, whether they be real or even, demonically influenced or negative or hallucinations, it's still perceived as real to them in the moment and therefore has an impact. And so it's being mindful of that and careful to let this person walk that experience out and then work through it with them.
Now, let me mention one other thing, just a challenge to parents and to pastors and others that are influential on their children and other people around them. This, from my students who evaluate a series of evidences for the existence of God, they will put near death, deathbed experiences, and miracles as three of the top things that
Convince them
that,
of,
that are compelling to
yeah,
them
yeah,
for believing in God. The film Heaven is for Real impacted a lot of my students. They will talk about that to this day when they saw it when they were younger, and it greatly impacted their life. They felt like this was strong evidence. Don't turn them off when they talk to you about this. I think
mm,
some pastors are so afraid of these experiences that they just shut down people's conversations and say, well, that's probably of the devil, or I don't see that
yeah,
specifically in the Bible. So
yeah,
boom, 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 and then just move on. They need somebody to talk about if they've had the experience, they need somebody to talk it through with. And if Christians don't talk to them and say, "Hey, there's a lot of what you've experienced that's really consistent with a Christian faith. Let's talk about it." Okay. If you don't talk to them about it, they may go to somebody who's got some really cultish ideas or whatever, but is willing to listen to their experience and integrate it into their faith, whatever it is. We need to be able to minister to these people and help them and be excited about it. I think God has worked in a lot of these people's lives, and maybe we quench the spirit. First Thessalonians 5, do not
not Gwen's fan.
quench the spirit, Paul told them. Thessalonians, don't quench the spirit. I think God is especially working these days through some visions, through some extraordinary experiences that people are having. And someone said the people who are least likely to get on board with what God's doing today are the ones who were involved in what he did in the past, because they think that's the only way God can work, is what worked to reach me. Well, maybe
Right.
God's working in a
Yeah.
new way through a lot of these experiences. And if it's God at work, we don't want to be the one quenching the spirit. So listen to them, see if God's at work in their lives, and help them use these experiences, use these films they're seeing to deepen their faith rather than go off into some type of occultic thing of, oh, well, if there are people on the other side, if there's a way that people are seeing deceased relatives on the other side, maybe I ought to go to a medium who's a professional at making the connection. Well, we need to warn people against these alternate paths. And maybe that's a good, maybe I just made my own segue there into, I do think a concern about the film. I want to be 95% positive. I'm glad the film's out there. I want everyone to see it. But when you start interviewing individuals who have written books on their experiences, this is what concerns certain people like John MacArthur when he began to read different books. And they call it they kind of deride it as the heaven tourism
Yeah,
genre,
and having
where
tourism.
people are getting all this theology about heaven from their experiences. We
Mm,
really don't know a lot of these people personally.
mm,
And there is an ulterior motive. If you're publishing a book that you want to become a bestseller, there's a strong motivation to make things a little more exciting than they
yeah,
actually were,
embellish it.
or to appeal
Yeah.
to certain audiences to try to get more sales. The practice of just taking people's books that have written about their experiences and believing it, the Bible says the fool believes everything he hears. And I think sometimes with a film like this, rather than going to read the good research that's been done on near death or deathbed experiences, they go and read the experiences of those who are writing best-selling books and think that's the way to go after truth. But a lot of these books have kind of embellishments. Some people have mental illness. Some people have false memories. There are just all kinds of reasons to be writing different things. Don't believe everything you read. Don't believe every YouTube video you listen to. And I think I wish there had been a little more distinction there in the film, saying go to the good researchers. Don't just start reading everybody who claims to have had an experience and believing what they say.
Yeah, that's word to the wise right there, Steve. To summarize, just because near-death experiences are real and we have good evidence to believe them, that doesn't mean all of them are real and have good evidence to believe them. So it's just like don't it's kind of what would be the opposite of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? It's we have
Mm.
to discern the good from the bad, and you can't just open the door and say near death experiences are true and then let them all in and then create some worldview that's a smash up of all of them. And this is a saying I like to repeat often, is evidence doesn't exist in a vacuum, in that, yes, this is a great line of evidence that we want to bring in, but that doesn't suddenly just counteract all the other lines of evidence that we have, all the other arguments we have. It doesn't just suddenly render all of those obsolete. It needs to be able to coherently fit in with a worldview which has its lines of evidence for it. So again, evidence doesn't exist in a vacuum. That's how we can be discerning, is we understand that we can take these experiences and recognize that there's good evidence to believe them, but also recognize that there are going to be other factors that could in fact influence them, or like people are saying, oh well, I had something similar with DMT, or I saw a tunnel when I had a pilot's, I forget the name of it, where pilots see tunnel vision from the aircraft. So it's you can get some elements that are similar, and it may sound like somebody else had an NDE, but maybe it wasn't, right? And that's where you just have to be discerning, like Steve says, but don't quench the spirit. Know that some of these people did have very much a real experience where they experienced either hell or heaven. And it's important for us to not just throw that to the side and be like, oh, that's interesting. It's a meaningful and deeply impactful thing for them. Just like if I told you, my wife died, right? Like that's a serious paramount thing that may have happened for me. And if people are just like, oh yeah, sure, whatever, man, it would be very challenging for me, because where would the support be? Where would I
Hurtful.
have? Yeah, it'd be hurtful. So how would I have the ability to properly find healing and support and community post something like that? So I think of these as the same, because it very much is the same. I mean, you're dying, and then you're having these experiences, and then coming back to the life, and then telling people this is what happened, and this is what's true, and this is what's real, and I'm moving all my value systems over here now. And that's a lot. That is a lot to deal with.
And I should mention, you were talking at some point, you mentioned a naturalistic thing, maybe DMT or something, but
Yeah.
there was a mention in the film about, that I thought was a little awkward, you to where a I believe he was a physician who had done research, and a person had died in his care, and there were still some gamma radiation going on in this person's brain for,
Gamma waves.
like
Yeah.
30 seconds
Yeah.
30 seconds after their heart had stopped and all that, and he was trying to make the point, I think, that, "Hey, here's evidence that maybe consciousness could exist after death." To me, the point it was making, or that it could be made from it,
Yeah.
is that, "Oh, here's a naturalistic reason that people are having these experiences or reviewing their lives, because even after after your heartbeat has stopped,
Yeah.
after you're no longer breathing, oh, there's still activity there. So no wonder people are having these experiences." And I just say that articles have been written on this in more depth, but that doesn't explain, if it was all happening within the brain, how were Sabome's patients able to view, the experience from outside of their bodies.
Yeah.
Just because some gamma waves are being shown, it doesn't mean, number one, that they were really conscious or could even lay down a memory or anything, but it certainly doesn't explain how they were able to see things outside of their bodies. unless their soul had actually departed. It does not explain the Pam Reynolds case, which obviously in her case, there was nothing going on in the brain,
Hmm.
and yet she saw these things. So they just had a little snippet of that, and I just thought it was rather odd and didn't understand why they threw it in there.
I've
People have looked at those things and given very good explanations as to
Yeah.
why that maybe it's just a last gasp. Like if you see a snake that died an hour ago, it may still be writhing. Maybe the same thing goes on in our brain where even after the oxygen's cut off,
Yeah.
it makes a desperate attempt to get back to consciousness within a few seconds, but then it just goes flatline.
Yeah, I agree with you. That aspect of the film was fascinating. I wasn't familiar with that study. I would I would like to do more investigation into the study and the outcomes and the opinions and so on and so forth of it all. But it felt more like, to me, it was kind of like evidence for dualism is kind of how it kind of came across to me, is
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
um for some inexplanatory reason, this person who was dying suddenly went in post what seemed to be clinical death point and had 30 seconds of just pleasant memories and pleasantries. And, he had stated that it served as consolation to families to know that the final moments of their loved ones were pleasant. Uh, I thought that was a little bit of a reach personally, because it just, I guess for me, it's like on naturalism. It's like, yeah, well, the last 30 seconds were pleasant. And it's just kind of like, well, I would be more of a nihilist personally if naturalism were true. That's just me. But um, he was talking about it in terms of, I felt like it was the angle, and I was trying to be as courteous as I could to him because he didn't really expressly, he was very scientific about his explanation. Let's just say that he didn't really give his interpretation of the data so much as he said, here was the data, here's why the data was impactful. And then this is how I personally apply the data in situations. It's like, hey, I know your loved one just died, but just know this: the last 30 seconds of life was super great for them. It's like, okay, thanks, man. Um,
Whatever. But
yeah,
hey, I don't want that to take away from the film. There are always
no,
I never see a film that I wouldn't change in some way. There are some things I do differently, but I think it's a great film to get people to thinking, introduce them to research. If you've already been researching near death and deathbed experiences, again, the name of the film is After Death,
yep,
Angel Studios. I think it's still out in theaters.
yeah,
It
yeah,
was last time I looked.
yeah,
Go see it. If you don't have any money, they've probably got somebody who's paid it ahead that you can
yeah.
get
Go
a
to their
ticket
website.
online, I think. Angel Studios. There's a good interview. One of the interviews was, I thought, very good with one of the producers, if not the main producer of it. That was a very good interview. There was a panel discussion of some of the people involved last Friday. Dr. Sabone was on that. And you can, there's just a lot to it. See the movie. It was good. It was encouraging. I'm glad I saw it.
So Steve, the movie critic, would recommend. 2 thumbs up.
2 thumbs up, or if I were to do Rotten Tomatoes, what would it be? 5, I don't
Five.
know, star don't get me too much into that. I'm a
It would be
neophyte when it
five
comes to
tomatoes.
movie re
Steve
Is
gives.
it 5 are 5 tomatoes good? I thought you threw tomatoes at bad shows. I'm very confused, but I was a good film. Go see it.
I'm gonna put that in the description of this video. Steve gives it 5 tomatoes, and people just be like, "What does that mean? Is that terrible, or is it 5 tomatoes to
It
throw at it?" Hmm. No, good movie, guys. Definitely see it. Very informative. It's a great film to catch up if you are not familiar with near death and the phenomena. It's a great film to kind of catch you up real quick. And then, of course, if you want to go further, there's more episodes that we have coming and have done. So definitely check those out. And of course, always go pick up the books, Sabum, Dr. Long, Kenneth Ring, all the ones out there. There's so many good ones out there for you guys to check out. Maybe Steve, maybe one of these days we'll do an episode of like, if I wanted to go and research near death experiences and start with the good studies, what should I start with? Right. And we do like our top 10 of these are the ones you should read to really get a foundation for that. So maybe we do that in the future at some point. So I don't know. We'll see. Your face is telling me no, but I don't know. Anyway.
Oh, that's good. My mind's just still on the tomatoes. I move slow with this stuff. I'm
All
trying to
right.
figure out the 5 tomatoes. You move on. But hey, this has been good.
Yeah,
I
this is a
think
good
we
one.
need to review this and good introduction to the field.
Awesome. All right. Well, God bless. We'll see you guys next week where we'll be doing